Imagine this. You're walking through a grand harbor carved in rose-colored stone and humming with life. Ships with vast purple sails line the docks. Their hulls bear inscriptions not in Latin, but in an elegant, flowing script, Punic. The air is thick with the scent of saffron, cedarwood, and sea salt. Fishermen chant in Phoenician tongue. Merchants shout prices in Carthaginian dialects. On the breeze, you hear prayers whispered not to Jupiter or Christ, but to Baal and Tanit. Temples rise not with Roman columns, but with sweeping sandstone arches etched in glyphs older than Rome itself. Children recite verses from the Book of Navigation, not Virgil. The city's skyline is crowned not with crosses or imperial eagles, but with the sigil of the horse, the sacred symbol of Carthage. Statues of Hannibal Barca stand tall in every square, hand extended toward the Alps he once crossed, not as a destroyer, but as the founder of a world built not on conquest, but on resilience. Now imagine this. Across Europe, laws aren't written in Latin. The great universities in Gaul, Iberia, even Britannia, teach in Punic. The foundations of Western civilization don't come from the Roman Senate, but from Carthaginian merchant councils. The rhythm of history beats not with the march of Roman legions, but with the measured pulse of trade ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean. Power flows not from empire, but from enterprise. 1,000 years of European history, rewritten, not by war, but by endurance, because once, just once, victory was possible. If a few decisions had changed, if a few orders had arrived on time, if the old city of Carthage had held its nerve, Rome would have fallen, and history, our history, would have bent in an entirely different direction. But Carthage didn't need to burn Rome to win. It only needed to survive. And in this world, in this path not taken, Carthage did survive. It didn't dominate. It didn't conquer the world. It simply endured. Quietly, brilliantly, permanently. So ask yourself, what if Carthage had defeated Rome? What if Hannibal's genius was not a lost legend, but the beginning of a new age? What if our world had been shaped not by swords, but by sails? What if the greatest empire that never was actually had been? Welcome to What If Wars, the channel where lost possibilities come back to life. If you're new here, subscribe now and join us as we retrace the roads not taken, because today we don't tell the story of a fallen empire. We tell the story of one that could have risen and lasted. Two powers faced each other across the same sea and imagined different futures for it. Rome, hard, methodical, a republic whose citizens wore armor as a civic uniform. Carthage, coastal, mercantile, a thalassocracy whose strength rode on cedar hulls and silver ingots. Between them lay Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Spanish littoral, and the grainy hinge of North Africa. Trade lanes and honor codes pulled them into collisions that began as local quarrels and hardened into existential war. The First Punic War opened in 264 BC over Messana, and then all of Sicily. Carthage owned the water, Rome owned the will. With no blue water tradition, Rome cut timber, copied captured ships, drilled crews like legions, and fixed a brutal solution to seamanship with the corvus, iron bridges that nailed ships together and turned waves into fields for infantry. For 2 decades, fleets shattered against storms and each other. Rome learned the language of the sea in shipwreck and salvage. Carthage learned that audacity could outbid experience. The final check came at the Aegates Islands, where a lean Roman fleet smashed a heavier Carthaginian convoy. Sicily changed hands. Sardinia and Corsica followed in the aftermath, seized while Carthage bled from internal revolt. Indemnities drained coffers, prestige evaporated, and inside the city, unpaid mercenaries turned their spears inward and besieged their own employers until Hannibal Barca crushed the rebellion with a citizen levy and iron discipline. From that trauma, a strategy and a dynasty emerged. The Barcids pivoted west to rebuild strength in Iberia, rich in silver, timber, and men who took to war with the fierce pride of hill tribes and the precision of drilled infantry. Hasdrubal the Fair founded Carthago Nova as a barbed harbor on the Spanish coast. Treaties fixed boundaries at the Ebro, but Rome extended a protective hand to Saguntum south of that river, a thin legal thread strong enough to pull both powers back into war when Hannibal Barca, Hamilcar's son, attacked the city. In 218 BC, Hannibal moved before Rome could set the board. He broke out of Spain, beat the Pyrenees, crossed the Rhone, and aimed at the Alps, choosing a route so savage it destroyed almost as many men as it delivered. What reached the Po plain was smaller, harder, and led by a commander whose eyes measured terrain like a craftsman judges grain in wood. Rome's consuls came out to break him. He broke them instead. At the Trebia, he lured legions across a winter river and struck as cold water clamped their muscles. At Lake Trasimene, he pulled a marching column into fog and pressed it against hills until organization dissolved and a Roman army ceased to exist. Panic rippled through farms and forums. Rome appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus, who stitched a policy of avoidance and attrition, a shadow that refused open battle and burned its own grain to starve the invader. The city hated it, called it cowardice, and then, driven by pride, took the field again at Cannae. On the plain, near the Aufidus in 216 BC, Rome stacked men in depth to bulldoze the Carthaginian center. Hannibal gave them that center. Iberians and Gauls formed into a shallow crescent that bent backward under pressure without breaking, while African heavy infantry waited on the wings and Numidian and Carthaginian horse tore into Roman flanks. The bend became a cup. The cup became a cage. The slaughter was geometric. Tens of thousands died where they stood. Consular authority and noble lineages vanished in dust and iron. Allies wavered. Capua defected. Tarentum opened its gates. Macedon extended a hand from across the Adriatic. The Roman Republic stood, swaying. And still, Hannibal did not march on the walls of Rome. The reason was not lack of will. It was material. He had no siege train, no fleet to feed a siege, no steady pipeline of men and pay. He sent letters south to Carthage, elephants, engines, silver, soldiers, and the council weighed ledgers, rivalries, and fears. The politics of a commercial oligarchy met the urgencies of total war and chose delay. Carthage debated while Rome recreated itself. The Republic learned from defeat without changing its character. It refused ransom, raised fresh legions from citizens and allies, and stored Cannae as a scar rather than a tomb. Fabius's caution and Marcellus's aggressiveness alternated to harry Hannibal's foraging and choke his Italian diplomacy. More important, a young patrician, Publius Cornelius Scipio, looked away from the Italian theater and saw the true artery of Carthaginian power flowing through Spain. Scipio crossed to Iberia and in 209 BC struck at the hinge, Carthago Nova. He surprised the garrison with speed and local water knowledge, stormed the city, seized arsenals, hostages, and silver mines, and converted local elites through clemency and guarantees. With each campaign, he trained a generation of Roman soldiers to fight in manipular flexibility against Iberian and African styles. Carthaginian generals in Spain fought hard, Hannibal Barca among them, but coordination faltered under a system that split authority among competing commanders. When Hasdrubal finally broke out to join his brother in Italy, Roman consuls intercepted him at the Metaurus in 207 BC. He died there. His head was thrown into Hannibal's camp. A brutal message carried by a river of defeat to the last Carthaginian army on Italian soil. Strategic gravity shifted. Rome held Spain, its mines, and the loyalty of many tribes. Carthage held Italy only in fragments under the shadow of a single extraordinary general. Scipio pushed the next lever, North Africa. In 204 BC, he landed near Utica, cut deals with Massinissa of Numidia, and dismantled the alliance web that had supported Carthage's cavalry arm for decades. Battles in Africa, near the Great Plains and the camps of Syphax, burned Carthaginian and Numidian tents alike and forced Hannibal's recall from Italy after more than 15 years of campaign. They met at Zama in 202 BC, two masters who understood the other's habits. Hannibal, deprived of his prime veterans but still dangerous in design, formed elephants in the van, mercenaries in the first line, citizens and Libyan heavy infantry in the second, and a reserve of veterans in the third. Scipio arranged maniples with lanes to bleed off the elephant charge, locked shields in depth, and anchored his wings with Roman and Numidian cavalry. When the elephants came, Horns and shouting split channels through the Roman formation. The animals passed, some trampling their own. The front ranks clashed hard. Carthaginian mercenaries fought well, then drifted back under pressure into the second line, sowing disorder. The decisive motion happened on the flanks. Massinissa and Laelius drove the Carthaginian cavalry from the field and returned at the exact hour when infantry lines were bone-tired. Their hammer blow into Hannibal's rear collapsed cohesion. A lifetime of genius could not reverse an empty supply chest and the absence of allies. The peace that followed did not merely punish, it caged. Carthage surrendered most of its fleet, swore not to wage war without Roman permission, paid heavy indemnities over decades, yielded Spain and its revenues, and sent noble hostages to Rome. Inside North Africa, the city rebuilt on trade and craft. Despite shackles, wealth returned to workshops and quays, but prosperity inside treaty walls stoked Roman suspicion. Statesmen walked into the Senate chamber and ended speeches with a single refrain that reduced policy to a ritual. Carthage must not be allowed to rise again. The Third Punic War grew from that creed and a set of provocations in Numidia. Carthage, harassed by Massinissa's encroachments, took up arms without Roman leave, breaching the treaty on paper, defending itself in fact. Rome responded with demands designed to break the city without battle. Hostages, then arms, then the order to abandon the coast and move inland. Carthage refused. The last war began in 149 BC. Siege defined it. Roman consuls struggled against walls defended by citizens who had become soldiers in the forge of necessity. The city threw chains across harbors, built new ships in hidden workshops, cast missiles from melted household bronze. Street by street, quarter by quarter, defense hardened. Only when Scipio Aemilianus took command did Roman discipline match Roman ambition. He tightened the noose, built a mole to choke the Kothon harbor, cut supply canals, and trained an assault force for house-to-house butchery. In 146 BC, his men breached the defenses, fought across roofs and through courtyards, set districts on fire, and climbed the heights of the Bursa. Survivors were dragged from temples. The population died, fled, or was sold. The city was leveled. The map kept the coast. It erased the name. The wars were decided long before the last torch. The ledger of causes reads cleanly. Carthage depended on composite armies of Libyan heavy infantry, Iberian scutari, Balearic slingers, Gaulish swordsmen, and Numidian horse. Formidable in combination, brittle in loyalty when pay ran late or politics at home wavered. A citizen body concentrated in commerce and naval service did not yield legions of farmer infantry prepared to die for homesteads. The state's highest offices, suffets, councils, and boards distributed authority widely, checked commanders sharply, and cultivated caution in the very hour that demanded concentration. The Council of 104 oversaw generals with suspicion. Victory risked creating men too popular to be safe. Strategic horizons prioritized trade corridors and balance sheets. War required a furnace that fed on unity. Rome's system inverted those liabilities. The annual levy and the oath-bound citizen and ally in a common slaughter resistance. Latin colonies tied conquered space to the mother city with roads, land grants, and treaties that delivered men on schedule. Defeat could be survived because the state had a deep reservoir of citizens and soci. Victory could be exploited because command rotated, but purpose did not. When Hannibal produced battlefield masterpieces, Rome produced another army. When he shattered reputations, Rome minted new ones. The Republic stitched failure into identity. The naval dimension mattered as much as infantry geometry. After the First Punic War, Carthage lost the freedom of the sea at scale. Its fleets, constrained by treaty and finance, could not deliver an army with siege equipment to Italy, could not guarantee the constant flow of pay and replacements that turned tactical brilliance into strategic decision. Hannibal's Italian campaign therefore relied on Italian defections and opportunistic logistics, not on persistent state support. He won battles in a hostile ecosystem that absorbed losses like a vast sponge and returned with force. Spain was the hinge. The silver of the mines funded Roman pay. The hostages bound tribes. The capture of Carthago Nova tore out the Carthaginian administrative heart in Iberia. From that moment, the initiative shifted irreversibly. When Hasdrubal died at the Metaurus, the last credible plan to converge brothers and crush the Republic in Italy died with him. When Massinissa changed sides, the best horsemen of the age moved from Punic to Roman payroll, and at Zama, that transfer wrote itself across the dust in a single decisive absence on the Carthaginian left. Carthage's story in these wars is not a parable of cowardice or decadence. It is the anatomy of a state optimized for prosperity, forced to fight a state optimized for endurance. In early phases, Carthage's naval power and Hannibal's operational genius made victory plausible, even proximate. But the city could not transform itself into a war society quickly enough. The moment after Cannae, when Italy shivered and the Senate measured coffins, demanded a siege train, a fleet convoy, a single voice issuing orders across seas and provinces. Instead came argument, thrift, dispersed authority, and the old comfort that trade would reopen and losses could be amortized. Rome answered with blood levies, an iron road system, and politicians who survived humiliation long enough to finance the next battle. By the time treaty terms penned Carthage into economic relevance without political freedom, the structural causes were permanent. A wealthy, industrious city could thrive again at its looms and docks. It could not field a sword without permission. That contradiction, prosperity with powerlessness, provoked fear in Rome and defiance in Carthage until siege resolved what negotiation could not. The ruins that Scipio Aemilianus surveyed in 146 BC were the endpoint of decisions made across 3 generations: how to raise soldiers, how to empower generals, how to bind allies, how to risk capital for survival. Nothing inevitable lives in those decisions. Each war shows margins thin enough to cut differently: a Senate vote to reinforce after Cannae, a tighter alliance with Numidia maintained by honor rather than miscalculation, a faster concentration of command in Iberia, a naval policy that rebuilt for convoys instead of caution. The historical record, read without myth, reveals an empire that could terrorize Rome in the field and outtrade it at sea, yet could not fuse those strengths into a durable strategy because its institutions were designed to prevent exactly the kind of centralization total war required. That is the reality to be altered if the outcome is to change, not the courage of troops or the genius of one man, but the alignment of state, army, allies, and time. After Cannae, Rome bled and steadied. Carthage hesitated and watched the moment cool. The alternate path begins there, in the weeks when panic still rang through Italy, and the Roman Senate counted dead consuls. In this version, Carthage does not debate, it legislates. The Council of 104 and the Suffet pass a wartime decree that concentrates strategy under a single board with power to allocate money, ships, and men without delay. Hanno's faction accepts it under the pressure of merchants who understand that defeat will cost more than war. The treasury opens the vaults of Iberian silver. Contracts flow across the quays. Shipyards thud with new keels. A convoy is built for a single purpose: to feed Hannibal the one thing genius cannot conjure: weight. The convoy carries grain, pay chests, engineers, carpenters, siege engines and parts, and a nucleus of citizen infantry drawn from Libya-Phoenician wards who receive land promises on return. With them sail seasoned Iberian scutari, Balearic slingers, and 2,000 Numidian horse secured by a pledge to Massinissa, a formal Carthaginian guarantee of his succession in exchange for exclusive cavalry service for the duration of the war. The deal is sealed not with rhetoric, but with hostages and gold. Syracuse, shifting after Hero's death, is courted with grain contracts and autonomy. Its harbor becomes a staging post that halves the risk of a single deep-water run. Macedon receives assurances of coordinated pressure in the Adriatic. Rome must look both east and south. The convoy leaves Carthage under moonless skies, hugs the African coast, leaps to Malta, then Syracuse, then slides along the Calabrian heel under the cover of Sicilian-based cruisers. It lands in Bruttium, where Hannibal's pickets have cleared beachheads, and the towns that already lean Punic open their gates for grain and coin. For the first time since crossing the Alps, Hannibal has a true base. Workshops sprout under awnings. Engineers pinion timbers into catapults and rams. Oxen haul timbers inland. A magazine system expands along the spine of southern Italy, from Croton through Petelia toward Capua. With a siege train, the geometry of the campaign changes. Hannibal no longer lives by ambush and maneuver alone. He can fix targets and grind them down. He does not throw an army at Rome's walls. Stone and hunger still favor the defender, but he cuts the arteries that feed the city's confidence. Fortified colonies that anchor Roman control in Campania and Apulia become objectives. Cumae, Nola, the citadel of Tarentum that in reality Rome held like a thorn within the city. In this timeline, the harbor and citadel are taken in sequence, not in halves, because rams and towers move behind shielded roads. Each captured strongpoint yields prisoners to trade, grain to store, and a message to allies. The invader is no longer a raider, he is a tenant. The Southern Alliance hardens. Capua does not fall back to Rome because it is no longer isolated. A chain of fortified depots links it to Bruttium by sea and road. Samnites and Bruttians see an exit from Roman dominance that does not require faith in miracles. It requires convoys and contracts that now exist. Hannibal's army rotates garrisons through magazines to rest and train. The Numidian horse screen wide to the north and east, snapping at Roman foragers and blinding consular reconnaissance. Rome tries to repeat its alternating rhythm, avoidance under Fabius, sudden lunges under bolder consuls, but the lunges now crash into prepared positions rather than mobile camps. Probes against the new depots yield losses that cannot be gauged as acceptable politics at home. Each defeat shakes Allied loyalty in Latium's periphery. The Senate still refuses ransom and still levies men, but a different ledger creeps across their tablets. Not the loss of one battle, but the gnawing reality of a resilient enemy with a port, engineers, horses, and pay. The strategy of starving the invader frays when the invader eats from magazines offloaded by sea. The second hinge lies in Spain. In fact, Scipio's capture of Carthago Nova in 209 BC broke Carthaginian administration in Iberia and unlocked mines, arsenals, and goodwill. In this timeline, the wartime board counters early. Before Scipio consolidates, Hannibal Barca receives unified command over Iberia with one clear order. No divided councils, no separate camps. Carthage hammers long fractious commanders into a single army by binding their staffs with shared pay chests and interlocking hostage arrangements. Families are moved to Carthago Nova, where their safety depends on obedience. Gisco's political talents are used to grease tribal compacts. Mago's mercantile instincts keep supply moving. Hasdrubal's operational steadiness holds the line. Scipio still comes fast and audacious, but finds a city with double garrisons, reinforced walls, and a fleet that refuses to sit idle. A Carthaginian squadron, rebuilt after years of treaty-fenced caution, does not seek a decisive sea battle. It seeks to keep the harbor open long enough to bleed off assaults and complicate Roman beachheads. Scipio's first stroke turns into a siege rather than a coup. That calendar change ripples everywhere. Without the sudden fall of Carthago Nova, Rome loses the burst of hostages, mines, and prestige that in reality tipped Iberia. Spanish tribes hedge instead of stampeding to Roman banners. Hasdrubal uses the time to shape his exit. He does not sprint for the Alps as a desperate gamble. He plans a transit. Depots are laid along the Ebro. Guides are bought in Gaul. Gold goes ahead to hire Celts to open passes. He carries fewer elephants and more cavalry remounts. Messaging to Hannibal travels by duplicate couriers through Bruttium and by sea through Syracuse. The consuls who tried to trap him at the Metaurus in reality never converge on exact coordinates because the windows are narrower and the reports are muddied by Numidian raids screening the Apennines. When Hasdrubal reaches the Po, he is not a surprise corpse in his brother's camp. He is a column with intact standards, 20,000 infantry, and 6,000 horse. The brothers meet in Umbria. Their councils fuse. They do not throw themselves against Rome's walls. They begin to erase Rome's capacity to keep two armies in the field. They aim first at the supply corridors that feed the Latin road network, the Via Appia south of Capua, the nodes at Beneventum and Venusia, the grain ports that still slip cargoes north under Roman control. Battles grow from these choices. One consular army tries to pry Capua free. The combined Punic armies hit it between depots and break it with cavalry on both wings. A mirror of Cannae done with deliberate logistics. Another Roman force tries to catch Hasdrubal's column strung out along a valley road and finds instead layered infantry and a reserve of Africans who punch where gaps open. The consuls retreat into Latium with armies mauled but not destroyed. The political cost is destruction enough. Massinissa keeps his word because his word has been paid for with the thing he prizes most, uncontested rule at home. Syphax, seeing the tide, trims his sails rather than gamble. Numidia sends remounts and scouts. Roman horse cannot recover parity. In Spain, Scipio still advances, but at a drag. With Carthago Nova holding and Iberian tribes watching the Italian theater before committing, he faces a war of position rather than of sudden conquest that unlock chain reactions. His victories, when they come later. Their shadow arrives too late to rescue Latium's confidence. The Roman Senate can still raise men. It cannot conjure time. A republic that could take defeats and grow harder now faces defeats that threaten the plank of allied loyalty on which it stands. Towns in Apulia and Campania that once calculated Rome would always return, now calculate that return as uncertainty. Levies answer slower, grain flows thinner, and the fire that kept the city in the field flickers behind arguments about whether to choose annihilation on the walls or negotiation at a table. The table appears in the form of envoys from Greek cities who fear their own annihilation if Rome and Carthage grind each other to ash. They broker proximity without ceremony. The terms that Carthage presents do not read like the fantasy of a conqueror. They read like the doctrine of survival hammered into policy. Rome will recognize the independence of southern Italian allies who have defected and will not reclaim them by arms. Rome will relinquish Sardinia and Corsica, seized in the shame of Carthaginian weakness after the First Punic War. Rome will renounce Spain. Its magistrates and tax farmers will evacuate beyond the Ebro. Rome will limit its fleet south of certain capes for a term of years and will not interfere with Carthaginian convoys in waters east of Sicily. Indemnities will flow, but lighter than those Rome imposed at Lutatius's peace. The purpose is not to humiliate a city that can only be dangerous when humiliated. Hostages will be exchanged on both sides as surety. Carthage will withdraw from Latium and dismantle forward depots in Campania. Rome will cease support to Numidian rivals and acknowledge Massinissa as king. These are not terms of domination. They are the careful geometry of a world where Carthage gets room to breathe and Rome keeps a core intact. Carthage does not ask for walls to be pulled down on the Tiber. It wants the western Mediterranean unbound, Spanish silver unchallenged, and southern Italian partners free to trade without the shadow of the Latin road. The treaty holds because it answers the arithmetic of each state. Carthage secures the resources that restore its maritime commonwealth, Spain's mines, Sicily's, and Africa's grain, a belt of friendly ports around the Middle Sea. Rome retains its ancestral lands and the honor of surviving a storm no other city could have borne. Its citizens return to farms. Its allies keep faith where faith is at least not absurd. The edges remain tense, but the center stops bleeding. In the quiet that follows, Carthage makes the changes war taught it to make. The wartime board dissolves, but not into the old fragmentation. A permanent magistracy, leaner than a dictator, firmer than a committee, takes charge of defense and oversees a small citizen corps army that anchors the old mercenary mix. Service earns land in Africa and Spain. Libby-Phoenician neighborhoods and colonial towns turn out infantry with obligations deeper than coin. The fleet is husbanded rather than flaunted, enough to guard convoys and police the Kothon, not enough to provoke. Numidia's treaty is renewed and written into marriage and trade. Horse and grain flow both ways. Syracuse and allied Greek ports keep their autonomy under commercial compacts rather than garrisons. The city's engineers return to docks and quarries. Its merchants reopen credit webs from Gades to Cyrene. Stability ceases to be a slogan and becomes a practice. Fewer grand campaigns, more quiet wars against piracy. Fewer triumphs, more balanced sheets that do not have to hide emergency spending. Hannibal does not disappear into bitterness. He returns as the architect of a system that converts his battlefield lessons into civic routines, routes surveyed and maintained, magazines prepositioned, cavalry remount stations accounted like warehouses, a staff school that teaches what Cannae meant beyond glory. The Senate that once feared him learns to use him because institutions, created in the panic after Cannae, now channel fame rather than destroy it. He is checked by law, not by envy. The divergence is not one miracle but two decisions taken in time, to feed a general with material when his enemy reeled, and to unify a theater in Spain so a brother could arrive rather than die on a riverbank. Everything that follows, treaty, reform, restraint, flows from that pair of choices, chosen because a city of traders finally understood that security is a form of profit and indecision the costliest expense. The treaty holds. The convoys keep their schedules. The warehouses at Carthage fill not only with grain and timber and ingots, but with the feeling a city breathes when it has survived its own obituary. Dock workers who once hammered rams now plane planks for merchant hulls. The same engineers who threw towers against Italian walls draft quieter marvels, piers that run deeper into the surf, sluices that drink winter rains into new cisterns, lighthouse fires that standardize their blaze by night and their smoke by day so a captain can read the coast like a script. Carthage codifies what war taught. A permanent magistracy sits between the Suffet and the Council of 104, a lean board charged only with defense and convoys. It does not make laws, it keeps them safe. Levies change their character. A small citizen corps, Libby Phoenician households drawn by promise of land in Africa, proconsularis in Spain, drills year-round with Libyan heavy infantry veterans and Iberian scutari who stayed for marriage and farms. Mercenaries still march when coin calls, but the spine of the army is no longer rented. It is owned. Contracts for foreign troops attached to depots and routes rather than to personalities. Loyalty runs along supply, not through the favor of a single general. The lesson of Cannae turns into procedure. Magazines inland at 10-day intervals. Cavalry remount stations every 30 miles. Lanes for elephants replaced by lanes for wagons, each with numbers and stewards and penalties for delay. The fleet that returns to the Kothon is not a parade. It is a schedule. Squadrons are assigned to sea lanes like shepherds to flocks. Warships sit at the edges of convoys instead of hunting glory. Captains keep ledgers as carefully as pilots keep charts. Carthage issues a uniform set of beacon codes and harbor signals from Gades to Hadramedum so that storms no longer turn talent into wreckage. The city standardizes weights, measures, and the geometry of a fair hull. Ratios posted on cedar boards in the shipyards. Deviations fined. It does not seek naval battles. It starves piracy with certainty and speed. The treaty's map creates a new equilibrium. Rome keeps Latium, the spines of the Apennines, and the pride of survival. The Latin roads still reach in stone to the edges of Italy, but beyond those edges, the Punic Sea takes over. Sardinia and Corsica return to the web that feeds Africa's ports. Spain becomes a lattice of protectorates tied by tariffs and tribunals rather than by garrisons. Carthago Nova, Gades, Malacca, and the valleys behind them thrum with the work of reconciliation. Hill tribes trade ore for olive presses, salt for iron, guard work for grazing rights. Tribal chiefs send sons to be pages in Punic counting houses and return reading contracts as well as terrain. North Africa becomes a garden engineered rather than imagined. Cisterns, those honeycombs under stones, multiply. Terraces rise on slopes where rain once ran fast and empty to the sea. The olive moves inward from the coast. Press houses dot the roads. Amphorae stack in whitened courtyards. Leptis magna grows its quays like fingers. Hadramedum doubles its warehouses. Hippo diaritis damps its lagoons and turns them into salterns that feed 3 fleets. The city feeds the sea, and the sea feeds the city. Religion follows commerce, but this time it tempers it. Carthage has learned what zeal costs in politics. Temples to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit still receive oil and vows. Processions still braid through streets on feast days. But in the mercantile quarter, a Greek stoa sits across from a Punic shrine without argument, and names for the same winds blow in different tongues in the same logbooks. When new cults float in from Alexandria with scholars and spices, the city grants them corners to breathe. Orthodoxy is for balances and hulls. The gods answer to markets and marriages. The Hellenistic East feels the adjustment like a wind change. Ptolemaic Egypt, too heavy for its own throne and too rich to collapse quickly, welcomes Carthaginian convoys into Alexandria on special tariffs. Punic brokers rent whole arcades along the Canopic Way and move papyrus and glass as if they were olive oil and tin. Seleucid satraps far ashore and farther from certainty accept Carthaginian arbitration in grain disputes because Carthage's judges care more for payment schedules than for palace scandal. The old rivalry with Greek merchants that once flared around Sicily cools into a pact. Greek minds build the mathematics of navigation. Punic shipwrights turn numbers into ribs. Both sides split the profit. Syracuse remains itself, proud and keen and jealous of its theater. It sells grain to both, and theater tickets to everyone. Massinissa reigns without a Roman to whisper against him. Numidian horse graze wide and trade marrow for bronze. The agreement that bought his loyalty in war matures into habit. His sons and Carthaginian daughters weave households along a frontier that neither army needs to patrol. When raiders test the edges, detachments of Numidian light cavalry fan out like wind over barley and return with prisoners and horses. The Punic magistracy sends fines first and iron second. The line between city and steppe blurs into an economy. Rome learns to be a republic without empire. It tightens its municipal bonds, heals the countryside with land grants to men who came home with more scars than silver, and untangles debts that grew like vines around citizens' names during the long years of levy. Latin remains the tongue of laws from the Aventine to the Alban Hills. Beyond them, dialects thicken and harden in their old valleys. The Senate still argues under painted ceilings. Consuls still stamp fasces into soil each year. But when Rome looks to sea, it sees schedules that a treaty forbids it to interrupt. Its pride moves inward and upward, aqueducts that thread hills, drains that quiet swamps, basilicas where clients crowd to hear verdicts. It does not swell. It densifies. Along the western coast, the language map begins to ripple differently. Punic, once a merchant's code, becomes a civic language in belts of cities that look outward from Iberia and southern Gaul. Greek persists where theaters and schools and old coinages keep it alive. Inland, the Celtic tongues hold longer because no Latin road and Latin veterans arrive to standardize speech in their market squares. A traveler sailing from Gades to Massalia hears Punic numbers on the docks, Greek philosophy in porticos, and a chorus of Celtic bargains when caravans roll down from the hinterland. The words for anchor and invoice, custody and average settle in Punic because insurance policies and whole contracts require a neutral tongue. Latin stays sovereign in Latium. It does not become the sea's grammar. Education changes timbre. Carthage funds schools for pilots and accountants with the same seriousness it once reserved for arsenals. Young men master not only the periplus but the abacus. Sons of tribes learn to tally duty and draft a letter of credit. Daughters of dockside houses keep books as meticulously as they keep oil lamps full. Libraries collect not only poems and treaties, but land registers and rainfall logs. A century of weather becomes a table for future farmers. The university that would have grown from a Roman forum grows instead from warehouses and wharfs, chairs in mathematics of navigation, in the law of general average, in irrigation and orchard craft, in the rhetoric of arbitration. The army looks smaller and older on parade because it is designed to be used more rarely. Units rotate through garrison towns and depots. Inspections read like audits. Armor is maintained under penalty. Spearheads are counted. Leather is oiled like keel seams. The old heroic dash, the charge that breaks a line and wins a legend, gives way to the steady labor of drill, watch schedules, and marches that arrive on time. When the state fights, it fights to restore schedules. Raids by pirates are not answered with expeditions to far coasts, but with quiet strangulation, faster escorts, better harbor masters, new fees that reward informers, and choke fences. Risk is not eliminated, it is priced. Architecture follows function. The Kothon becomes a template exported like a pattern to allied ports. A double basin with a war island inside only where it is needed. A merchant ring with identical slips so a captain can dock blindfolded by counting pilasters. Warehouses standardize their vaults and vents. Fire breaks lace markets. Granaries lift on stone mushrooms against rats and damp. Streets run a little wider, where ox carts must turn, and a little tighter, where shade shortens distance. Fountains multiply at corners where queues form. Baths sprout not as monuments, but as instruments of health in crowded quarters. A city that nearly starved now measures abundance with drains and cisterns. Time stretches. Without a Roman Empire to march marble roads into every valley, Europe develops like a coastline at low tide, creeks, inlets, basins of culture rather than a single swell. Power pulses along the sea. The old Greek East remains articulate and argumentative. The Punic West becomes numerate and procedural. The Celtic interior stays textured with clan and oath, but learns contracts that bind across winters. Islands mature as brokers. Sicily stops being the prize armies bleed for and becomes the hinge, both sides oil. Sardinia sells metal and cheese without changing gods. Corsica sells timber and silence. Faith finds new currents. The small communities following a crucified teacher from Judea speak first to cities that speak Greek. They write letters to harbors where dialects meet. In this world, their words move as far as ships move. And they do move. But no emperor wakes one day to convert a garrison into a creed. There is no imperial altar to supplant. Persecutions still flare where governors fear unrest, but there is no single apparatus to smash or sanctify them. The faith grows as a net grows, not as a flag rises. Syncretism is rule, not scandal. A bishop argues with a shipowner about tithes and tariffs under a colonnade, while a priest of Tanit passes with a procession, and nobody writes a law about either. Centuries will pass before any one doctrine tries to police all dockside talk. Commerce resists it without speeches. Conflict does not disappear. In the far west, beyond gades, tin and skins still lure hard men to bad decisions. In the north, tribes that taste coin want more of it, and sometimes come to take it with axes. In Iberia, old wounds between valleys open when taxes feel like tribute rather than toll. Carthage answers not with legions marching for glory, but with the same two instruments it used to survive, contract and corridor. Governors carry scales and seals. Behind them, if needed, march cohorts of Libyan heavy infantry and Numidian horse who can break a camp at dawn and be out of sight by noon. Punishment is aimed at choke points, bridges, passes, markets, so that violence loses its path to profit. Hannibal grows old. His voice frays, but his habits never do. He visits depots and asks granary overseers for tallies and then for their hands to see if the work leaves calluses or ink stains only. He tutors sons of families who once feared him and reads dispatches from Spain with a penknife opening wax and a map under his palm. When he dies, he leaves not an empty plinth for speeches, but a curriculum, a list of things a state must count if it wants to live through storms. The city buries him with the same restraint it used to win peace. No triumphs, no hysterias, only a column by the harbor with a carved line that pilots can read as they clear the roadstead. Speed, prudence, return. Rome, relieved of imperial hunger, becomes a nation of laws more than of legions. It writes debt reforms that would have been postponed forever by distant wars. It breaks the worst clause of usury without breaking credit. Its allies become neighbors rather than fuel. It remembers Cannae as a caution against pride, and Zama as a story with a different ending in another world. Either way, it survives with its tongue, its gods, and its stubborn municipal soul intact. The Mediterranean takes on a new color, less crimson, more salt. Charts improve faster than eulogies. The names of winds become entries in tables. Currents are drawn with small arrows along margins. Reefs and sandbars move each season on parchments that are recopied in winter and distributed in spring. Insurance premiums fall for routes that adopt the Carthaginian lighthouse code. Port syndics compete to claim the best safety records. Men who would once have sought honor in war now seek it in reliability, which turns out to be harder. In the evenings, when the air cools over the Kothon and the lamps come on one by one, the city sounds like a ledger singing. Hammers, gulls, the slap of rope against mast, the low thunder of grain in a chute, and the human music that rises when 1,000 ordinary ambitions share walls. No one calls it empire. It is not the right word. It is a habit, to measure, to promise, to arrive, to repair, to privilege the sail over the sword and the schedule over the shout, to last. The world beyond the straits is still wide and often wild, but the Middle Sea is domesticated in the best sense, a home that endures its storms because its people learn to count what matters and to refuse what ruins them. The Punic tongue spreads by invoice and lullaby along coasts that used to speak fear. Greek keeps teaching people how to ask hard questions. Latin keeps verdicts tight within hills that echo with farming songs. No language is crowned. The sea will not allow it. The city that almost died becomes the city others copy. Protectorates in Sicily rule themselves through councils that balance grain quotas with harbor repairs. Spanish towns handle debt disputes in mixed benches staffed by locals and Punic jurists. North African villages dig new cisterns each year under civic festivals that blend old prayers and new schedules. Children play at counting ships. Old men count winters and declare this one better than the last because the granary's shadow against the wall fell a finger width farther in late summer. What began as survival stiffens into a civilization that knows its limits and builds inside them. No triumphal arches carry chariots, no legions carve highways toward the horizon, but convoys leave on time, bread is cheap, and treaties last longer than tempers. Sails outnumber swords. Sails teach patience. Patience keeps the peace. And the peace, dense and daily and unremarkable to those born inside it, is the most remarkable thing the ancient world ever produced. The peace holds long enough to become habit. Habit becomes culture. Culture, when repeated across harbors and harvest and ledger lines, becomes a map the world reads without knowing who first drew it. Begin with time. Empires crash quickly. Trade rewrites slowly. Without a Roman Empire swelling and snapping, the Mediterranean does not suffer a single system-wide failure that pulls roads, coinage, and magistracies down at once. Shocks still arrive, bad harvests, storms that rake coasts, epidemics that ride caravans, but there is no imperial spine to break and no achingly long wait for some successor to restring it. Distributed networks absorb, reroute, recover. Ports compete to reopen first. Insurance pools spread risk. Grain moves because prices rise, not because an emperor issues a decree. Collapse, when it comes, is local. Resilience is regional. Learning takes a different shape. Instead of monasteries carrying letters inland after roads rot, schools gather where ships gather. In Carthage, in Carthago Nova, in Massalia, in Syracuse, in Alexandria, where Greek memory and Punic money sit across the same table. Navigation is a science, then a syllabus, the geometry of hulls, the algebra of interest in exchange, the trigonometry of stars. These become crafts taught with chalk, knotted rope, and slate in rooms that smell of pitch and papyrus. Libraries catalog win names beside law codes. A boy who will never command a cohort learns to read a lighthouse code and draft a clean contract. A girl who will never inherit a farm balances an account and measures olive yield against rainfall notes copied from her grandmother's weather book. Power redefines itself. Without a Roman Empire to reward iron with marble, honor migrates from the triumphal arch to the dependable schedule. Respect accrues to the captain who leaves and arrives on the dot, to the harbor master who cuts theft by half, to the magistrate who settles debt disputes before anger boils. The age tells different stories to its children, not of a single legion planting an eagle beyond the mountains, but of a convoy beating a storm because each hull held its line, not of a city humbled by siege and razed, but of a city kept from famine by a last-hour consignment of grain. The heroic becomes procedural. The procedural becomes sacred. Language follows cargo. Latin remains the speech of courts from the Tiber to the Alban hills. It does not climb every coast on the back of garrisons and colonists. Greek continues as the tongue of argument and experiment from the Aegean to Alexandria. It does not bow beneath imperial uniformity. Punic spreads along planks and invoices, not banners. Numbers, weights, clauses, the terse nouns of custody and average. The terms a captain and a creditor must share if either hopes to prosper. By the time a traveler has sailed from Gades to Massalia to Syracuse and back, he can buy, sell, and swear oaths in Punic, even if he dreams in another language. Inland, Celtic dialects keep their texture because no Latin veteran towns are planted in their market squares to sand them smooth. The Mediterranean becomes polyglot by design and by advantage. No tongue is crowned. The sea refuses to be ruled by a single grammar. Faith takes water routes instead of marching orders. The small communities that confess the God of Israel, through the story of a crucified teacher, write letters to harbors first, as they always did. The letters go farther because ships go farther and more often. They gather congregations in cities already trained to host multiple rites without panic. Persecutions happen where governors fear riot or where trade guilds resent new tithes. Conversions happen because merchants sponsor poorhouses and sailors bring tales, not because an emperor turns baptism into policy. Without a Constantine, bishops learn coalition instead of command. Without an imperial church, creeds compete longer and leave more space for dissent and exchange. Syncretism, despised by conquerors and adored by markets, remains the heir of porticos. Tanit's festivals, Greek philosophies, Jewish law, Christian liturgy, friction, argument, borrowing, coexistence, repetition. Orthodoxy hardens where it must. People want certainty, but never gains tools sharp enough to pare the sea to one belief. Slavery persists because antiquity does not abandon old money overnight, but it bends earlier under the pressures of contracts and reputation. Carthage, once a buyer of bodies the way Rome was a buyer of land, finds that stable schedules hate shock. Large slave revolts interrupt shipping. Pirates thrive on ragged labor. Investors punish ports with reputations for unrest. The law of manumission grows teeth. Debt bondage displaces chattel in many cities because contracts are easier to ensure than chains are to guard. Guilds and protectorates prefer free hands tied to deadlines and penalties. Unfreedom survives where profit refuses alternatives in mines and estates. But even there, calculation forces mitigation, more manumissions for term service, more oversight to prevent losses that ripple through insurers and lenders. Humaneness does not reign, efficiency does, but efficiency trims cruelty's wing. Politics in Rome evolves under constraint instead of under conquests. A republic with limits looks inward out of necessity and discovers a durable pride that does not require provinces. The urban poor gain water and mills instead of victory parades. Veterans receive plots closer to home. Debt reforms cut the ugliest knots that would have strangled the city had war remained its diet. Latin law polishes itself in city after city inside Italy until it shines from use. Senators boast of aqueducts and drains. Censors compete to lower theft in markets. Consuls campaign on promises to reduce debt interest and widen roads, not to sack Carthage or Antioch. The world ceases to be an appetite and becomes again the hills and rivers that gave Rome its name. The interior of Europe grows differently. No massed legionary road net forces towns into uniformity. No imperial tax web reels them into a single administrative sea. Tribal federations persist longer. Hill towns keep their gods and their speech and slowly learn the neutral terms of port law. Pledges, liens, guarantees. Germanic migrations still occur because hunger and weather care nothing for treaties, but they flow toward markets as much as against walls. Where war bands historically found legions to fight and provinces to strip, here they find dockside work and hard bargains. They mix, they marry, they vanish into names written in two scripts on warehouse ledgers. There are raids, there are burnings. There is grief, but there is no single imperial body to wound mortally. No sack of a capital can end the world because the world is not organized around one heart. Technology follows the demands of reliable profit. Sails get smarter. Rigging becomes a discipline. The quarter rudder does not become a museum piece. It improves, standardized, ferruled in bronze where it once split. Dry docks sound like thunder when new timbers are driven home. Pitch factories feed an industry. Lighthouses multiply and speak in codes that reduce shipwreck, like law reduces theft. Inland, irrigation is measured, terraces layered against slopes that once bled their soil to the sea. The plow does not become a legionary's successor. It becomes a merchant's ally. In the Sahel, caravan routes thicken where the Punic Numidian axis gives them a safe northern hinge. Salt and gold, and stories cross the desert to ports that know how to count. The map darkens with towns sooner along coasts and river mouths, later in forests and plains. When metallurgy jumps forward, it does so to meet ship nails and presses and hinges before it refines swords. Does the world avoid a dark age? The phrase itself belongs to a story where one empire falls and another takes centuries to rediscover its nerves. In this world, there is no single twilight. There are dark pockets and bright coasts, storms and recoveries, cities that go silent and cities that expand their warehouse rows, knowledge pools where hulls moor. A flood can swallow a valley and leave the sea trading on the other side of the hill the next morning. A plague can thin crews in one quarter and be met by quarantine rules posted at harbor gates in another. The light does not go out. It flickers, shifts, returns. War never disappears. Men still covet, leaders still misjudge, and youth still believes itself immortal. But the largest prizes, universal empire, religious monopoly, are never placed on the table. If no one can win everything, fewer leaders burn everything to try. Violence contracts to sizes finance can tolerate. Punitive expeditions occur, but they are brief and pointed. A smashed pirate haven, a fined city, a seized bridge. Long marches for glory find no budget line. What of art? The Mediterranean builds for breath and shade, for traffic and cleaning, for the weight of grain and the flow of sewage. Basilicas exist, but they serve lawsuits as often as liturgy. Theaters sell more tickets than temples sell miracles. Statues of generals still dot squares, but the greatest column in Carthage lists lighthouse codes and tides. Aesthetics hugs utility and discovers a spare, relentless beauty in repetition and proportion. People visiting from inland praise cleanliness the way pilgrims elsewhere praised relics. Clean water becomes the miracle everyone believes in. All this rests on memory, the memory of fire along Carthage's walls and the taste of ash in a city's mouth, the memory of Roman fields trampled and Roman sons not returning, the memory of a day near the Aufidus when history itself seemed to choose blood as its permanent color. Memory guides compromise. It insists on counting. It brands into law the limits that keep prosperity from becoming arrogance and arrogance from inviting annihilation. It teaches that a convoy's punctuality can hold more lives than a legion's courage, and that there is a kind of heroism in steady labor that conquerors never wrote songs for because they did not know how to hear it. And yet, even in a world built to outlast storms, a whisper remains, the human itch to measure the life not lived. Stand on the quay at dusk when the harbor lights step into the dark one by one and listen to the city that almost died. You will hear history humming beneath the everyday, the thud of sacks, the creak of rope, the laughter spilling from a wine shop, the last orders shouted from a pier, and beneath that, a quieter question. What if, after Cannae, a convoy had failed to sail? What if Hasdrubal had fallen by another river? What if fear had again been louder than law? The answer hides in everything you can see, in the olive groves terraced where gullies once ran raw, in the school by the docks where a child learns the names of winds before she can name the constellations, in the treaty stone at the city gate with weathered lines that have outlasted 3 generations' tempers, in the fact that you are standing here at all, breathing air salted by a harbor that learned, very slowly, to prefer schedules to slogans and sails to swords. Perhaps in another world, the Punic tongue echoes through the streets of Paris. Perhaps in that world, power grew not from swords, but from sails. This is What If Wars, where we reimagine the past to reflect on our future. Subscribe for more untold legacies.